This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Joseph Cohen from Queens College in the City University of New York. For more, visit theannexpodcast.com.
I have a banter item, but I'd really rather I didn't, because I'd rather this whole thing never happened. But I very recently got to know the Bruin Republicans, and I literally, like a few days ago, I went to lunch with them, and I stood up and gave some remarks and talked about academia and all sorts of stuff like that. And then one of the things I did is I gave them a very brief synopsis of Amy Binder's book and told them about the contrast between the Harvard Republican. I mean, she calls them like elite Eastern elite or something like that, because the Harvard IRB made her, but everybody knows, and not from Amy, but from the students themselves. I'm sorry, Binder and Wood. I should make clear that she has a co-author on that. Anyway, be like the Harvard students who are just like, let's discuss ideas and that sort of thing. Don't be like the University of Colorado Boulder students who are just like, let's stir shit up. And then I said very specifically, in case the point wasn't clear, do not invite Milo Yiannopoulos. And so what did I see yesterday, evening? But the Bruin Republicans have invited Milo Yiannopoulos. And this is like after his heyday and, after the, apologies for pederasty thing, which I actually think is like among the least of the bad things he's done. Although what did seem to be the thing that got him kicked out of polite society, kind of like Roy Moore, where, there's much worse things than him, being banned from a shopping mall.
Moving on.
Well, I'm not saying I'd have somebody who was banned from a shopping mall and only banned from a shopping mall over for dinner, but I'm saying compared to his just total lawlessness and being kicked out, censored by this.
Just wait until your daughter turns 15 and a 35-year-old guy tries to approach her. We'll see how you.
No, I'm not saying I'd like that, but I do care about that sort of thing. I'm not implying that I don't. I'm just saying that there's also very serious issues with the rule of law and violating court orders and that sort of thing. Anyway, and his kind of general weird politics of shock. Anyway, so last night I look at I'm looking, I see that they'd invited him, and so I wrote them a letter and said, this is a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea because it's the wrong thing to do, because this is not somebody who's out there spreading ideas, even controversial ideas. This is somebody where his sole purpose is to upset people. And he says horrible things in order to upset people, to which there's no real content. And I draw a strong distinction between people, and I mentioned people like, say, Heather McDonald, who they invited last year, where she says things that people disagree with and she attracts protesters, but she's not doing it specifically to upset people. She's doing it because she has a point that she feels is important in entirely good faith. But I was hoping to send it to them in time to cancel it, but because it had already gone through and been announced, I figured I'd just send it to my friends at the Weekly Standard, and they published it. And as of the time we started this podcast, it was apparently getting a lot of traffic, and it tweeted or retweeted like 1,000 times. And I actually had to unplug my office phone because, when I walked in, I saw that it was full of voicemail. So we could record this podcast.
Next up is the Tucker Carlson.
You should just unplug your office phone as a matter of policy.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I walked in and I saw the little, voicemail indicator, and I'm like, okay, the only time I get voicemail is when it's daylight savings time, and the voicemail administrator is announcing that there's going to be daylight savings time. And so it's like, if it's anything else, it's like, this is good.
Or, dear professor, I'm not going to make the exam. That's the other one that I get.
Oh, no. Nobody under 60 will call you. They're going to email.
They'd rather take the exam than speak on the phone.
Yeah, that's right.
So what has been the response? What?
Well, for the most part, it's positive. So the vast majority of what I was seeing on Twitter was people basically agreeing with me that, it's ill-advised for the Bruin Republicans to invite him, although I think there's also a very important caveat that I absolutely believe they have the right to. And I would take that to the point of saying that not only do they have the right to, but I don't believe in a heckler's veto. And so I think that if there is a disruptive protest, that the police should use force if necessary to prevent that disruptive protest. If there's a non-disruptive protest outside the event, I think that's fine and great. And I think those people are just as entitled to voice their disapproval as I did of Yiannopoulos, as the Bruin Republicans are to host him. But, there's a big difference between things that you can do and you have the right to do and things that you ought to do. And this is, to me, this is a case of free speech, and there's no question about that. And anything I'm about to say does not mitigate that. And like I said, I think the police should prevent a heckler's veto if necessary. But it's also very low value speech.
Gabriel, I find this fascinating. So you actually believe that the police should use force for someone being a heckler?
Well, I don't think that they should take out their service revolver and blow their brains out. But I think that someone who disrupts a speech, should be escorted out by the police. And if they refuse to leave, the police should drag them out. Okay. Because I think otherwise that you have a heckler's veto.
Yeah.
And I think, to the extent possible, this should be as non-injurious as possible.
I get that. But, at the same time, I think people who have weapons should not be the ones in charge of forcibly removing someone from a place in which they're heckling people simply because things can escalate. So I just want to put that caveat out there. I agree with you in that I actually think people should be allowed to speak. And if people try and shut down that speech, right, I think it's horrible, right? Because, next week, it'll be someone else's turn, right? Virtuous or non-virtuous. I think everyone has a right to speak, and then we get to then talk through the merits of that speech afterwards, right? But I don't believe that people should be hurt.
I'd certainly prefer that they're not hurt, and I'd prefer that when the police say, "Okay, you've shouted your objections for 30 seconds, it's time to go," that the person walk out. And then if they refuse to walk out, I'd prefer that they be dragged out without injury, but push comes to shove. I think that if you don't have, the police there to prevent heckler's vetoes, you ultimately allow a heckler's veto. Mm-hmm. But the important thing is that we agree on 90% of this.
Yes. And I think also too, the difference is like, if you parse through it, is that, the person speaking who's given the platform, that's free speech. Whereas the person heckling, that's a verbal, what do they call it? Not action, but I'm trying to think of the legalese for that. And that is actually something that's subject to, that's not supported by the First Amendment. So.
Well, that you could get into technicalities. I'm sure First Amendment lawyers have gotten into a lot of this, but like I said, I 100% support the right of people to protest immediately outside an event, as long as they don't, try and rush the stage or make it impossible for people who want to attend the event to come in. Mm-hmm. And that has nothing to do with how much I sympathize with the people on stage or how much I sympathize with the people outside.
Gabe, what's the appeal of this guy?
Well, that's a very good question, right? And I think that, his entire appeal is, like that old saying about, Dadaism and, modern artists in general, where their whole shtick was épater le bourgeois, shock the middle classes. Mm-hmm. I think his whole appeal is, épater les social justice warriors. His whole shtick is absolutely, and I think I can understand why people like him, right? I can understand why, if you're in an ideological minority in campus and you see people around you making ridiculous claims and expecting them to be, completely respected and getting indignant when they're not, that these are fun people to make fun of, right? I mean, campus is nothing if not full of Margaret Dumonts, and so it's natural that a Marx brother will come along and, try and upset them because it's fun to upset killjoys, right? I mean, when somebody is completely humorless and angry there's nothing more amusing than to upset them. So I can understand that appeal. I just think it's childish. And, even if it is done, I think it should be done in a way where the content itself is not despicable. And this is why I think it's fine for them to invite somebody like Ben Shapiro, where, you read between the lines, it's pretty obvious that the reason to invite Ben Shapiro is because it upsets people. But I also don't think he's a creep. And so I think that's acceptable. And in fact, fine. And I have no problems with it whatsoever. But, when you have somebody where his whole point is just to say outrageous things in order to get a rise out of people, you can understand why that's fun to annoy people. It's fun to piss people off, especially if they inevitably rise to it. But
can I offer sort of a naive, non-expert diagnosis about all of this trolling? Is like, it's also like, that's what you do when you don't have policy ideas. I mean, it's I don't really have anything to offer policy wise. So let's just talk about Mexicans and make liberals mad.
Well, I think there's something to that. I wouldn't say that there's no policy ideas out there, and we've had this conversation a few times, and I'm not going to tell you guys go read Yuval Levin again, although I guess that's, but although I guess I just did. What's that rhetorical?
Yeah, maybe that's unfair. I'll withdraw that. I'll withdraw this slight.
No. Well, listen, I mean, here, I think it is fair in the sense of if there is a problem that in certain sectors of the right, well, actually, I'll be broader than this. We've seen a broad shift towards negative partisanship, like across the country, and in fact, in some respects, internationally, because you see the same trends in Great Britain. I don't know about other countries, but in those, two English-speaking democracies, you've definitely seen a rise in negative partisanship, and I wouldn't be surprised if it also characterizes Canada too, because you occasionally hear someone refer to like Stephen Harper, and people talk about him as if he's like the second coming of Adolf Hitler, which just seems ridiculous to me. So you have this rise in negative partisanship where people have a very strong affiliation with their partisan identity, but it almost entirely consists of hating the other side without a substantive thing. And I think this is something that characterizes the campus right. But I think it's also something that characterizes the campus left to a certain extent, where a big part of it is just opposing various things that they see as, oppressive. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. And likewise, the campus right is almost entirely oriented now towards opposing things that they see as, politically correct nonsense. And maybe they're right, and maybe they're wrong.
You know what? I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to make a connection between, there's been all this conversation about porn and how tweens and teens are learning about sex from watching free porn, which is not a good idea. And what it does is it fills you with these ideas about, these tropes of masculinity and domination and submission. And you think, okay, that's what sex is. And so that's what I'm going to do. And so basically I'm blaming the internet for everything. So from porn to let's model how you get a point across, right? To the other side, right? What you do is you say really snarky things and you don't care whether or not in doing so you're dehumanizing people. In fact, you get tons of laughs for it, and you also get tons of followers for it. And people think you're a rock star without really thinking about the content of it, right? And so there you go. I'm blaming the internet.
Okay, Grandma.
That's a great metaphor. But go ahead, Kieran.
I think that and there is that point about this wider context or wider audience matters for the likes of Milo as well, right? Because there's, on the one hand, there's the dynamic that Gabriel was just describing that unfolds and has unfolded for decades just on campuses, as you have people with different political views, 19 and 20-year-olds shockingly getting head up about things. But on the other hand, so on that level, the audience is the UCLA students and their factions within them. But more broadly, then UCLA itself is the show, and you have people like Milo as a sort of nationally bankrolled, organizationally backed. Somebody's paying for him or to travel around the place, and the goal is to sort of use the campus setting as the sort of demonstration point to show a third audience, the people you want, I guess,
Fox
supporting
News
you
viewers.
Ultimately.
You're saying Fox
yeah, exactly.
News
viewers. Having their views confirmed about terrible things that go on campus, and that's something that Milo is merely the worst of a wide range. It runs from him all the way along to, I saw, who was it, like John Chait this morning complaining, going on about the decline of free speech rights at Brown because I think 11 or 15 undergraduates had signed an open letter calling for somebody not to be invited, and it's like, there's like a little this national industry of let's explain how students at Oberlin or Brown or conservatives at UCLA or Berkeley are destroying or defending Western civilization. It's a little tiresome.
I think you're totally right about that, but also,
is he so right? We should delete this bit.
You're not tiresome, and I have to say, Gabe, I admire a person of your intellectual seriousness. I know that you really mean it when if you're willing to write an open letter, which is just one step short of writing a "Why I'm Leaving Los Angeles" Medium piece.
I should have put it in Medium instead of the Weekly Standard.
And I fully agree with you. These guys, I mean, everyone's in it for the lulz. And that's really that gets a little annoying after a while.
But also, like, I am so tired of seeing the National Review take on student newspapers. It's like punching down a little bit. No, like it takes on like a 20-year-old who is repeating something that he heard in his class from like a national political publication. I find they take on teenagers.
So, like, Andrew Sullivan had a point about this in, I forget where it was, The Atlantic or something, just like last week, where he was saying, kind of raising this point of, well, why do we care what a bunch of dumb undergrads say? And, we're finding the 20 most immature undergrads on campus and acting as if it's the end of Western civilization. And his argument was, well, because these people then go and get jobs and, expect to change the institutions they end up in. And you can see this shift in journalism where a lot of journalism, there's the interesting thing in that the internet hasn't really decreased the amount of journalism that's out there, but it has radically changed it, right? Journalism in the 1990s was mostly local news coverage, whereas journalism now, a very high proportion of it is, did you see this outrageous thing that happened? Here's a reaction to it.
I think it's an attack on the academy through the students. And to my mind, like, I see that, and I see the constant attacks on the journalistic profession, and I see it on police now. And it's just basically, I feel like it's a lot of this is happening in a grander working the ref context, where you're just delegitimizing other sources of information.
Yeah, so
I guess Andrew, still be a little careful. I mean, if you ask me, there's a whole generation of 40-something journos or early 50-something journos, like for everybody from Andrew Sullivan to Katie Royfey, who are running the same shtick that they ran in as 22-year-olds in 1995.
Yeah,
they're still talking about reliving political correctness, date rape, everything. Yeah. It's all, everything old is new again.
So what do you guys think? I actually have mixed feelings about this idea. So in my piece I talked about how there's a lack of adult supervision, precisely because you don't have of the conservative students, that precisely because there's so few conservative faculty, you don't have the kind of adult supervision, and so they end up just kind of being raised by wolves. And without an adult in the room to say, no, that's not a good idea, the Pied Piper comes from the Mercers and says, it'll be a lot of lulls and it'll trigger the libs if we bring in Milo. By the way, I don't know if the Mercers are underwriting this or not. My understanding is that they kind of cut things off with him, but they were responsible for his big tour last year. Anyway, so I kind of find that appealing. Obviously I do because I wrote it. But then on the other hand, as we were just talking about with like the Brown students, you have left-wing students saying crazy things. And, there's no shortage of left-wing faculty on campus, the vast, vast majority of whom are center left, not far left, and very responsible in their attitude towards politics. But the adult supervision doesn't seem to help that much with the left-wing students. And maybe it's just kids are going to be crazy, whether or not.
Yeah, I mean, when I was an undergraduate in Ireland in the distant past, I was involved in the college debating society there, which is a sort of a big activity in the UK and Ireland. And one year, people invited, and I was peripheral to it, David Irving to come and give a talk, the Holocaust denier and general purpose, Nazi historian. And that was mostly a decision carried out by a bunch of, young gobshites, basically, who were all sort of, by the standards of Irish society at the time, pretty liberal, and all the rest of it, but also just thought this would be a grand old sort of bit of controversy, and it was a really stupid thing to do, and everyone, it didn't go well, and Irving ended up not. He was heckled out of it, and ended up not speaking. The police intervened, and he was sort of whisked away before he could speak. And so on the one hand, nobody got the completely nil benefit of hearing him speak on a topic they knew nothing about anyway. Couldn't conceive engage with him, in a way that would rebut him. And then on the other hand, he got lots of free publicity and the benefit of seeming like some sort of martyr. So, and that really had little to do with, that was just a case of the politics of the thing, of the person were just orthogonal to to what the people who were organizing it believed. They were just young and stupid. Or we were just young and stupid.
Yeah, that's kind of symbiotic relationship. Reminds me of how the George Wallace campaign used to make sure that hippies would show up to protest because, it was beneficial to him and his position. Hi, everyone. This is Gabriel with a little postscript to that segment. When we recorded Wednesday around 1 p.m. Eastern Time, my weekly standard piece had been out for a few hours and was getting a lot of attention, but the Bruin Republicans had not yet decided to rescind the invitation. Later that evening, the Bruin Republicans met and voted to rescind the invitation to Yannopoulos. Their statement on their Facebook page was explicit that they made this decision because of internal dissent among their officers. As such, I think it's important to stress the important role of Mariella Muro, the officer who recognized that the talk was counterproductive and asked my help. I also want to stress that this really was the student's decision. And in service of that, I'm going to read a passage from the Los Angeles Times story on this incident. When an official student organization invites a speaker, according to standard procedures, the administration must honor that invitation no matter how horrendous or intellectually vacuous. We also do not allow protests to become so disruptive as to silence the invited speaker from communicating with a willing audience. That said, we are not shy about expressing our own values. I explicitly and publicly reject inflammatory trolling designed to trick students into feeling desperate celebrity. Let's have a serious conversation about immigration or any other matter instead of taking the bait. That passage sounds like it's from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, but it's actually from Jerry Kang, our Vice Chancellor for Diversity here at UCLA, and I agree with every word of it. I'm proud of the university for allowing students the freedom to host ill-conceived and controversial speech, just as I am of Mariella for convincing her fellow students to refrain from using that freedom to host odious speech, and likewise of the club for ultimately being receptive to her moral suasion.
You've been listening to The Annex, a sociology podcast. For more information, visit theannexpodcast.com. Music is by Lena Orsa. Our production team included Anika Chowdhury and Liseth Moreno. On behalf of the Annex team, I'm Joe Cohen. Thanks for listening.